morning. Please turn with me to Psalm 26 as we look at the subject this morning, eggs. Regardless of what you had for breakfast, we are looking at the subject eggs this morning. Why? Because not too long ago I had a chance to either click on something or talk to someone who helped me answer the question, why do you put eggs in everything you bake? And it became obvious that they serve as a kind of glue. Why? Because if you guys just bake the ingredients without some sort of bonding agent, they don't necessarily stick together so good. And so eggs go into an awful lot of things to serve as a functional bond between things that otherwise might taste good but might not taste quite the same if you didn't have them stuck together the right way. So why does that matter? Because in Psalm 26, we are looking at David talk about something that hit me a little bit differently than I saw it this week, where over and over again, I know I have my own dead horse issues, but when David talks about stuff over and over again, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to talk about that again. But like I say, I don't want to get to the point where I'm excluding recurring themes from the word just because Marcus doesn't want to preach them. And so what I ended up seeing was over and over again. There are a couple of things that go to that distinction we talked about a little bit this morning when Brother John Sherman helped us understand that there's a distinction between personality and character. We say it from time to time. Personality tends to be what I project. Character more or less refers to what I actually am. And there are two things that serve as the eggs of character that David is going to mention in Psalm 26 when he begins out. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, egg number one. And I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and my mind, for your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk in your faithfulness. Understand that when we see, as we saw in Psalm 23, one of our brother's favorite Psalms, when he's talking about lead me along paths of righteousness, doesn't matter how far God leads me along a path of righteousness if my integrity does not form the glue between all of the things that God is asking me to do along that road. Look at it from a practical perspective. One of the things when we talk about the peace that surpasses all understanding, it's nice to have nice stuff. And beyond having nice stuff, it's nice to be in peaceful places. And one of the things that bonds the peace together in a healthy environment is trustworthiness. And so when we're looking at integrity, we are looking at one of the things that God offers us that gives us the staying power when he gives us nice stuff. Ever heard the saying, we can't have nice things. We can't have nice things. That saying refers to times in which in life, no matter what we get, it's hard to keep it nice because there are ways to soil and sully it again. And so when I am asking God, like David is asking God, God, vindicate me from all of these things that are coming against me, as our brother John Dawson said in class this morning. Some of the attacks on David, they had to do with disparaging his character, not just taking his life. And so when he is asking God to vindicate me, he's saying not so that I can go back into a place where I drag myself out into the places I asked you to save me from. Integrity is the thing that not only keeps my relationships with the people around me glued in a peaceful place, it keeps me glued to the place of peace. And so we talk about that verse from time to time that says, nobody can snatch me out of the hand of God. They sure can't. But I sure can unglue myself because he does not describe this as a hostage situation. And one of the things that glues me into that place of security that God has given me is integrity. And so when I am asking God for nice stuff, the question is, we often ask it, what am I doing with it? And integrity has a lot to do with, as he said, John, nobody's seen God at any time. Nobody's seen God at any time. And so we know our attitude towards God in terms of our attitude toward the brethren. Describe salvation in a way y'all have heard it many times before, but to some folks I hadn't talked to before, and I told them, it's like that thing where I want to go to a place. Y'all don't have to lock doors as much around here, but I come from a locked door place. It's a place where you don't have to lock doors. You don't have to check stories. You don't have to worry about whether or not people are looking out for your best interest. That's all that's there. And so integrity is the glue in those types of relationships where once again, we say from time to time, what can I get the God who has everything? You can't get him a new Rolls Royce. I don't think he cares. He rides on cherubim, and they ride in a blink. Zero to whatever if I were fortunate enough to get a Tesla, zero to whatever my Tesla could do is nothing compared to what God already has. And so we said from time to time, the things that we can get God are simply times in which he doesn't have to repeat the things he's tried to impress upon us over and over again. The number of times when he simply finds someone who is willing to step up and do the things that he would otherwise have to send another servant or take resources from somewhere else to get done. Why? Because he has to know. Because we looked at it this morning when Daniel was getting an answer to his prayer. Someone who quite possibly could be a pre-incarnate Christ came to him and explained the delay in getting his answer because he was delayed with the the prince of Persia. And so there are some things that help, like we said in class. I don't understand how this works, but God uses us, people, and spiritual beings in ways that we don't always understand. And so there are times when the thing that can keep me glued to the fact that God will still give me an answer is integrity. It's that thing where when all the folks started to leave Jesus because he said something funny about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and then he turned to I think it was the 12, the disciples, and he said, "Are you going to leave too?" And Peter gave probably what in my later years is probably one of the best answers I've ever heard in the Bible. To whom should we go? Where else are we going to go? And so in a lot of ways, life brings you into situations that help confront you with the reality that the only other place to go is somewhere where my integrity can't go to. And so the very thing when our brother talks about faithfulness to God and trusting him, the thing that keeps you glued to God is your integrity. The thing that helps you realize that I can go another way, but I can't go that way and keep my integrity. And so when he says in Hebrews, says one of your favorite books, right? Hebrews 11, it is impossible, without faith it is impossible to please God because he is a rewarder of those who believe that he is, in New King James, those who diligently seek him. And so integrity is one of those measuring things that helps you stay glued to God. You have to believe that at some point he will answer you. And the thing I love about David is there are times in the Psalms where he says, I don't necessarily know whether I'm going to see the good of the Lord in this life. But then there are other times, like a brother mentioned in class, where he is firmly convinced that no matter how many times the waves take him under, the thing that seems to resurface about David's character is I'm going to see God in peace. And whatever I was thinking, whatever was taking me under, that's one thing I'm still confident in. That resurfaces in his character because he realizes Psalm 26. Why is he asking God to vindicate in verse 1? I have walked in my integrity and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Verse 4, there's another egg though. For I do not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. Wait a minute, David, you're a hypocrite. When you were running from Saul, weren't you pretending to be crazy? Were you really crazy, David? What's a hypocrite mean? It means you're pretending to be one thing when you're another. You weren't crazy, you were scared. Oh, wait a minute. When you were living with the Philistines that second time, were you really raiding the villages that you said you were raiding? Or were you raiding villages that could have gotten you killed by that very king that took you in? You were pretending to be one thing to him while you were doing another. David, who's the hypocrite? Aren't you the hypocrite just for saying this? What does it say at the top of David? David said it. Yeah, that's the tough thing about hypocrisy. Put me under enough pressure, I'm a hypocrite too. Oh, that's how it works. And if you don't think so, think it's just Marcus, pray God. God, test me and try me. Please don't pray that. Please don't pray that. As much as we might have differences, there's some things I don't wish on nobody. Don't pray that. Pray God for mercy. Pray that part of the prayer, right? Because he doesn't have to put us in a very tight vice. He doesn't have to squeeze the vice very tight before we would start to see some things in our character pop out that we would be embarrassed to. So what does David mean here? if he can consistently say that he does not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. Maybe turn with me to Isaiah chapter 5 to possibly understand what he might be talking about. Please turn with me to Isaiah chapter 5 to understand what he might be talking about. There are a number of woes. I think I'm counting 7 right now because I always like to see 7, but maybe closer to 6 that we're going to see in this 5th chapter of Isaiah. The one I want to focus on is in chapter 18. In verse 18 of chapter 5. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes, who say, let him be quick, let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come that we may know it. Challenging God. But that whole concept of drawing iniquity with cords of falsehood is why that whole concept of eggs came to mind. Because what is happening is falsehood is becoming the glue of larger activities. It's not just a thing. They're not lying for lying's sake. They're lying to accomplish another purpose. And so when we look at falsehood, I heard another preacher say it maybe a week or two ago. That's why when I decide which things I'm going to just leave and which things I'm going to actually talk about, when it keeps coming up over and over again. It came up in the last set of 7 chapters? It came up in the set of 7 before that. And I'm pretty sure it came up in the set of 7 before that. How do I know? Turn back with me to Psalm 5. And so when I heard a preacher talking about, I very rarely as a preacher hear people lie just for the sake of lying. There's almost something else. You heard marijuana? Marijuana, it's legal here. I was driving folks around town. Look at that, that's weed. I was like, yeah, it's legal up here. And people call it, in some places where it's not legal anymore, they say it's dangerous because it's a gateway drug. Right. Cords of falsehood are a gateway to other types of things. Verse 5, chapter 5, please. Chapter 5, verse 9. From our very first set of readings. I skipped over it. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Please turn forward with me to chapter 10. That whole portion. Please, if you write or you take verses down, please mark that verse 9, where it links that whole concept of there is no truth in their mouths to their inmost self is destruction. The reason why that second egg is so dangerous is when it becomes a part of my inmost self, I start to do some really strange things. Please turn with me to chapter 10, Psalm 10, verse 6, where we read a little bit this morning, beginning of verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand afar away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes they have devised. Now, verse 6, talking about the inner counsel of the wicked man. He says, in his heart, I shall not be moved throughout all generations. I shall not meet adversity. Understand the first thing that can happen when deceit has, like we said, these are not lies that are being told outwardly. When they have begun to sink into my inmost self, I begin to look at them as a stronghold. Why is that so important? Because over and over again, as we see in the Psalms, if you look at that term, refuge. When I went through the Psalms, when we went through them roughly 3 years ago, refuge was a recurring term. Stronghold is one of those recurring terms that comes up over and over again with refuge. That is one of those paths that David is saying. When he's saying, lead me along paths of righteousness, he is saying there is another path that we don't necessarily see. And here's the danger of it. Just like the marijuana is a gateway drug, they don't simply offer you crack with marijuana. There's something else that subtly becomes a need as you recreationally use marijuana. And here's the thing. As you begin to reject the concept of integrity, we all have needs. My self-esteem is going to have to come from somewhere. My sense of security is going to have to come from somewhere. And what he is saying here in chapter 6 is, he says in his heart, I shall not be moved throughout all generations. It's the salvation comment that we mentioned before, where I heard another preacher, and I heard someone kind enough to come up after service and say, it's that thing that I heard when I was told to pray the prayer. It still didn't give me the confidence that through all generations I would not be moved. That's me adding that paraphrase. And so what's happening now is, in addition or as an alternative to God's truth, which is there's certain things I have to do if I really want to have the peace that surpasses understanding, I'm going to seek peace a different way. And so sometimes I say that whole concept of we will laugh at, well, no, hopefully we don't laugh at, but we will see the obvious problem with people who develop a drug problem to ease that sense of inner dis-ease, right? But all they're doing is what they call self-medicating. Understand, he's saying here that lies are a way of self-medicating. And when they get down into my inmost self and become my stronghold, I am in a very dangerous place. But it's not as dangerous as it can get. Why? Because he's going to keep talking. In verse 10, the helpless are crushed and sink down and fall by his might. He says, in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Please don't confuse that with a stronghold. That's confidence. See, he's no longer in a situation where I can't be attacked. It'll never get me. He's like, now look what happened in the verse before. The helpless are crushed and sink down and fall by his might. He's now on the attack. And so he has gone from using the lies that have sunk down into his inmost self to take a defensive position, and now he's the aggressor. They are his aggression is being drawn by cords of falsehood. And so now it's not just my sense or my need for peace. I'm not just self-medicating anymore. I'm now being encouraged to do evil because of the things that I've told me, or the things that I've adopted from others who have told me that it's okay, right? We talked about that whole concept in Deuteronomy, right? God was the one who did the warning in Deuteronomy. He said, beware of the one who blesses himself and says, even though I walk in my own ways or the stubbornness of my own heart, it's going to be okay. Don't let that sink down into your inmost self, is what God is talking about there, but that's what David, that's what he's talking about now. That's what I'm saying. Please, I've never asked you to do anything else. Please put a mark by verse 9. Be careful of what you allow to sink down into your inmost self. Why? Because guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it come the issues of life. My brother called it. I can't quote them, but I know what they generally say. I can point you in the way. You can read it for yourself, right? And so this is just another illustration of that principle. Guard your heart. David's talking about your inmost self. You need to protect that, because once these things start to go from becoming your sense of peace, your self-medication, to encouraging you to do, like we said, drawing iniquity with cords of falsehood, now you're on the offensive. Please look at verse 13. Verse 13 of chapter 10. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? And that's when it's starting to become a fixture. You ever heard about that? Those times when you see, it's been a while, somebody was talking about the Hollywood Walk of Fame. They didn't get invited to the Walk of Fame, so they had their own. Right? They put their own imprints in the wet cement. And that's what this verse is talking about. We want the wet cement to harden so that the imprint stays in there. But there are some things that David is saying do not need to form as a bonding agent in your character, because you do not want it to become fixed that God will not call into account. Why is that? Because in verse 14, David is going to say, oh no, wait a minute. But you do see, for you know mischief and vexation. Notice he doesn't say you deal with mischief and vexation as soon as it happens. That, you know what frightens me? What did he say? He says you note it. You note it. And so the reason why it gets into my inmost self is he doesn't check it right as I do it all the time. There's sometimes he does. That's why he says, do not despise the discipline of the Lord. Do not despise the discipline, because he disciplines those he loves. He tries to keep it from sinking down into my inmost self before it gets hardened into the concrete of my character. And so that's what he's trying to stop. Because David's saying, no, he takes note. And even though I don't feel any consequences, it's not like God doesn't see anymore. Well, we've said it over and over again. Over and over, one of the other things we've talked about David doing, he's praying over and over again in these Psalms. They're not just Psalms, he's praying. And what's he praying for? Oh, wait, go back to Psalm 16. Preserve me, 26. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. The first thing he's asking for is I'm not taking my own vengeance. And so to the degree what we see back in Psalm 10, where the things that are being done to the afflicted and the oppressed, what he's talking about in Psalm 22, the very psalm that Jesus quotes, he's like, even though I start out the psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? The beauty of that psalm is that David and Jesus, even though they feel abandoned, are still able to encourage people in the midst of their pain and their misery, understanding that they might not feel it right now, but they know. Turn to 22 for me, so it's not just me saying it. Verse 24. How can I encourage you, even as Jesus is hanging on the cross, making sure his mom is taken care of by John? Why? Verse 24, for he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from them, but he has heard when he cried. The dangerous thing about me letting eggs of dishonesty sink down into my character and become a fixture there is I'm over and over again squeezing out prayers against myself by people who God is listening to wail in the midst of their despair. The very last scene, one of the last scenes we're seeing in the Revelation, it's the souls under the altar. The souls under the altar. Those were the martyrs. But they're literally described as having their prayers going up to God from under the altar. How long, Lord? How long, O Lord, before you, same thing David was asking for, before you vindicate or take vengeance on our behalf? They're not just all up there singing Kumbaya. God has noted and they remember the way that they died. And God, does it say, oh, from this far corner of heaven, the martyrs are calling. What do you think God's notebook looks like? In that altar that's in heaven, he doesn't need Siri. He doesn't need a checklist. They're constantly calling. The Revelation literally says it. They're reminding him of the things that God willing, I do not participate in squeezing out of them by being the cause of their despair, because it says he does not forget. He's willing to forgive, but there is a thing that I need to, hopefully, God willing, before it sinks into my inmost self, avoid. Because what happens is over time, I like it when the pain stops. Like we said with the self-medication, there are times when I have an ache, and I like when the pain stops. But the pain does not always stop as an indication of a healthy thing. We've heard the proverb before, bullet over a gunshot wound. I'm sorry, Band-Aid over a gunshot wound. There are things I can do to numb the pain of what's going on that does not indicate that healing is actually taking place. And so what David is saying is that even though, yes, I pretended to be one person in front of one king, Philistia, and I pretended like I was carrying out certain raids that I wasn't carrying out when I came across maybe another, one of the Philistine kings. What happened was, as we often talk about, what was the motive? What was David doing? See, David was trying to save his life from an unjust execution. David was trying to save himself in a time when he shouldn't have been there in Philistia in the first place. He should have been simply fighting with Israel's armies, but he had to flee. And so it's not is an excuse. Of course, it's an excuse if you're making an excuse, or if, like David, you're prone to confessing. You just confess that it's something I shouldn't have done. But here's the thing. Out of all those things that David did that were hypocritical in front of the Philistines, the one question that we went back to from time to time in studying the life of David, how is it that a man who was a hypocrite probably got caught? You think his men didn't ever know? No, there's a time when they wanted to stone him too for getting the wives taken away, right? But there is something deeper than those moments of hypocrisy that bound David's soldiers to him. He got even more disloyal than that. Uriah much? Pretending to be one thing, faithful king of Israel. Not just killing a dude, not just taking a dude's wife, having him killed. He could have just provided for her, but he tried to marry her, and he did it actually. That added insult to injury, right? That's a 3-time loser on the very thing, the hypocrisy. Nathan, why do you think Nathan told the story? Because David was like, hey guys, guess what I did today? Sorry. That thing with Uriah, no. Nathan went to tell him a story because he was pretending to be one thing when he was actually, third time, hypocrisy. So how did David get forgiven? Once again, is it favoritism? Maybe. But you got to ask yourself, why did Ittai, the Gittite, what's Gittite mean? He was from Gath, the very place that was the hometown or the home region of the famous giant Goliath. So how are you going to get, we now got you as a 3-time hypocrite, David. How are you as a 3-time hypocrite going to be able to get people to still follow you? I'm just that charming. Well, that's one way, right? Why? Because I want to tell you a story about some other folks. Remember Judas much? Judas was a very different type of difference, we'll call it, between character and personality, right? But what was he trying to accomplish? He was actually trying to accomplish the death of the Christ, right? And Judas is a famous example. There's another man by the name of Ishmael, who turn with me real quick to Jeremiah, the 40th chapter. Jeremiah, the 40th chapter. There are times when God might send me a messenger that's trying to warn me and give me good counsel, but sometimes it's just hard to believe the depth or the severity of the warning that they're trying to offer. In chapter 40, if you have a subject heading at the top of your chapter, it may read Jeremiah remains in Judah. It's because there is a period of time after the exile where some were allowed to stay in Judah under the governance of a man by the name of Gedaliah. And after they got over their fear of what the Babylonians were going to do, they started to reassemble under Gedaliah, who proved to be a pretty good leader for a while. Verse 13, however, raises a complication. Now Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the leaders and forces in the open country came to Gedaliah at Mizpah and said to him, "Do you know that Baalis, the king of the Ammonites, has sent Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, to take your life?" But Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, would not believe them. Then Jehohanan, the son of Kareah, spoke secretly to Gedaliah at Mizpah. "Please let me go and strike down Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and no one will know it. Why should he take your life? So that all the Judeans who are gathered about you would be scattered, and the remnant of Judah would perish." Gedaliah was an important man. He didn't believe the warning. Let you know, first time I read this story, I was like, he's not going to kill him. He's going to show him mercy. The mercy's going to be returned. That dude killed Gedaliah. And the remnant was scattered. Some of them, in their fear, ended up going to a place God specifically told them not to go. And so in that situation, we're talking about, okay, how did Ishmael get closer than the Ammonites could? Well, how did it happen under Ezra and Nehemiah? During the rebuilding, there were those in Israel who acted or worked with the agents of Israel's enemies to basically provide access to the Gedaliahs, the Ezras, and the Nehemiahs. And so now, wait a minute. Did Gedaliah right off into the sunset like David and simply get the forgiveness for his hypocrisy? No, not Gedaliah. Did Ishmael? No, because the question comes once again, what was the motive? And so ultimately, when we look at the eggs of this passage, we are looking at Ishmael pretending to be one thing, and while he was actually another, pulling the cords of assassination with a false front. Judas accomplishing the contract on Jesus by pretending to be a disciple while he was trying to accomplish, getting a little bit of money. But sometimes it's not even the money. I wonder from time to time, really, was it 30 pieces of silver that he cared about? Or sometimes is it like, I watch The Matrix. I talk about from time to time. Anyway, there's the part in The Matrix where they're having the conversation with the guy who is eventually going to sell them out to the agents. And he's going back and he's lamenting. It's not so much any price that he's getting. He's going back into an artificial reality. But what he wants is a break from the struggle. He's tired of having to always be a fugitive. He's tired of always having to look at what he really is when what he was, it was a little bit cooler in the Matrix, even if it wasn't real. And so sometimes it's not so much the 30 pieces of silver that Judas might have wanted. What Paul warned about, once again, we talk about it from time to time. When he was warning those who wanted circumcision, in their later age, like we talked about, who really wants to be circumcised at an advanced age? Unless there is a more painful persecution as the alternative. And that's literally what Paul says is threatening the church at Galatia. It is like we said before, it's the persecution they're trying to get out of. And in order to get out of the persecution, sometimes we are pressured into situations where we're willing to pretend like we're still with the people of God, but we're really just looking for a way out, right? And so that is the pressure that really seems to be on Judas. The 30 pieces of silver might have been it, but I'm sure the life of an apostle might have gotten to him at that point. The real hardships of what it's like following Jesus. You want to follow me? The birds have nests, the foxes have holes. That's going to wear on you. And it might have been the pressure as opposed to the money that ended up making Judas present a face that really wasn't what was on his heart. And so when we're looking back at David, back in Psalm 62, the thing that Psalm 26, the thing that might have set David apart is something we've mentioned before. And it's that whole concept of what would make an Ittai the Gittite, what would make a Philistine want to now follow him and become the commander of a third of his army, basically leaving his own home and his own people, much like Esther left her people to show loyalty to Naomi. Why would you follow a guy who's a 3-time hypocrite? And you know what? I want that answer because I need it, right? As we've already said, you put me under enough pressure, I'll put up a false front too. And one of the reasons why it's easy for me not to judge Judas as hard as I might before I started realizing, wait a minute, he was suffering too. It wasn't like he was staying, like, you know, there are times you talk about times when you can stay at the nice hotels overseas and then sometimes you got to rough it. It wasn't like Judas was getting the nice hotels when everybody else was. No, he was out there with him. And so when I realized he was suffering too, it's a lot easier for me to take a step back and be like, wait a minute, let's not talk about that Judas guy so harshly because I wasn't carrying his cross, right? And even though most of them didn't betray him, the judgment belongs to God. The thing that sets David apart, though, is ultimately, like we said, it's that other egg. Verse 1, chapter 26. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. There is a time when even your enemies, literally says, we said it in 1 Peter, it's a treatise on how to suffer well. He said, look, everybody would look really good if you never had to suffer under difficult situations. But understand that that's literally what Christ was called to do, and that is one of the signs that you are actually his too. Nobody is impressed by, talked about your daughter runs half marathons. How impressed would you be if she drove a half marathon? Exactly. Nobody's impressed with people who drive the half marathon. You're impressed because they actually run it. And so when we're talking about standing up under unjust circumstances, that is what Christ is saying shows you the difference between people who are driving the marathon, we're doing well when things are good, and we're running. We're putting ourselves under the additional stress and strain of life that makes us want to quit. He says, if you can hold your integrity up under those circumstances, the sermon preaches itself. Because as people say, I'd rather see a sermon than hear a sermon any day. And so he's trying to help us understand situations in which, no matter what your gift is, I'm going to be real cheesy. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I talked about it before. No matter how much God might have blessed me to put all words in order, the sermon could be eviscerated within an hour of me stepping down off of the pulpit, depending upon the choices I make. You, however, could preach a sermon that endures based upon the choices you make an hour after the sermon. So you can go a completely different direction and fix what I could potentially damage with my poor choices. And God willing, it's just vice versa. God willing, we're all on the same page with whether we're speaking or whether we're silent. We're living with the kind of integrity that would make an Ittai the Gittite be like, yeah, I saw that dude do some hypocritical things, but he'll offer the defense for you. But I remember a time when I was scared of that same guy he's in front of too. I worked for that same boss. I wouldn't want to have to face him either. See, the beauty of integrity is just like your life can preach the sermon, Integrity often brings you allies you never knew you had. I talk about being on the mission field. I often talk about as much money as we might have as Americans. There are times when the people who are around you can surround you and remind you of how small your bank account really is. And the beauty of it is when they see situations that otherwise, be honest, brother, you don't have to talk. I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk for you, and if I'm wrong, correct me. There are times when our money overseas, it breeds resentment. It breeds frustration. And no matter how kind we are to the people we're trying to help, the fact that we can simply afford things that they have to struggle for a month to get, that's a hard bridge to cross. And so when you see people who have overcome that difficulty, and now in situations where you don't even know the things that are being cooked up about you, they're being squashed by people who love you. And even though they've seen you sin, they forgive you because there's something in your integrity that buys you a second chance. See, we often talk about things like integrity from the perspective of the obligation that it brings. But I guarantee you, if you walked into a lawyer's office, you'd have a hard time finding a lawyer you didn't know who wouldn't be asking you for a retainer. What's a retainer? It's a nice word for the thousands of dollars you're going to have to pay to get their time and attention. Integrity can get you some free lawyers that are better than any lawyer you could pay. Because even though they see you mess up, they love you. And beyond your mistakes, there's a stream. Just like Psalm 23, he leads me by before paths of righteousness. He leads me beside still waters. See, integrity is one of those things that says, when God willing, y'all know I'm not the most encouraging person on earth, but I try to be the kind of person who refreshes people enough that there's at least something in their heart that lights up because of some kindness I tried to show from a genuine place. And so ultimately, when we're talking about integrity, we're talking about being the kind of people that people can trust in a world where you can't ordinarily find that in everybody. One of the reasons why things are so valuable, we got a lot of rocks right out there in that front foyer or that thing right out there. You want to go try to sell one of those rocks to the jeweler down? Yeah, good luck with that. Because there are plenty of them. What's more rare? Diamonds, precious metals, things like that. Integrity's rare. And so when you become the kind of person that people can trust, over time, even if they don't like you, at a certain point they know that's a place I can go to for help. You know, I said it before, I was having a discussion one time with some people who criticized the congregation of the church for its position on same-sex marriage. And one of the things I had to remind someone of is even though if we had people at the congregation who would refuse to bake the cake for your wedding, do you want to know how many calls we've rejected from people who seem like or openly are living in same-sex relationships? See, because when word gets around town, who can I call? God willing, somebody here's earned the reputation of somebody that whatever your sexual preference is, I'm not trying to see you starve. And as long as I can disagree with you and maintain my integrity about what I believe about what you're doing, I'm here to help you. That's not rock character. That, God willing, is more akin to a precious metal that you can't find everywhere. Why? You want to show me the LGBT organizations that people are just picking up? Well, I can't go to the church for help. I'm going to go call my local. No, I don't know which one to call. I'm in a circle with all the different help organizations that help people when they come through town. I've done it in many different towns. I can tell you in all the towns I preached in, I've never found one that was dedicated to helping the LGBT community from their own community. That's not to be rude. I know it exists. And understand, I'm not saying churches are all right, because there is an element to church that says we don't want to help anybody. But understand, to the degree you are willing to help people that others consider outcasts, you are providing a rare, valuable gift that not everybody gets. And in that same community, like I told you before, I'm not doing this to brag. I'm doing this to say, I have gotten help from places, likewise, where I never would have expected it. And so it's a reciprocal relationship. Be honest, most of my recommendations coming out of college and grad school, my best recommendations came from professors in the LGBT community. I'm not ashamed to say it. Why? Was it because I required them to go to church in order to be my friend? Was it they required me to go to their meetings in order? No, it was mutual respect. Ittai the Gittite. Relationships that formed across different psychological or belief systems where we looked out for one another. And here, I've told you this story before. When I got locked out on campus, one of the students I was saddest to see go was a student I'm convinced was in the LGBT community. Because when I got locked out of my car on campus after dark, after all the buildings had closed, that student stayed after their job was done to help get me home. If I appreciate that kind of help, who would I be if all I was doing was preaching fire and brimstone to people who I called out to in my time of need? And so when David is getting forgiveness from his hypocrisy, it's because there was something in his character that people like Ittai the Gittite said that even though we got blood between us, bud, you have killed a lot of my people. But there is something about you that I still find refreshing enough that when your life is in danger, I'm willing to risk my life to preserve yours. That's the payback in integrity. And we shouldn't do it for the payback, but understand that it goes back to an old principle that Christ said in his ministry and God says over and over again. Like you said, Psalm 23 is one of those Psalms that we've probably heard since we were yay high. Even if you're not a believer, one of the principles that just about everybody knows, whether you're in the Word or not, or in the church or not, with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Often used in the pejorative as a, you're gonna get it. It's not always you're gonna get it. Sometimes it's, you're gonna get it. You're gonna get that love that you showed to a person you didn't have to show kindness to someday. And so when we're looking at these Psalms, these long descriptions of the mind of David that come out in the form of song and poetry, what we're getting to see, if you look back to what we studied in the life of David, is a man who is having the kindness of his integrity return to him in the moments of his deepest despair. Because that's what a lot of these Psalms are. These are Psalm 22, that Jesus, like we said, Jesus is quoting from the cross. In Jesus' moments of deepest despair, he's quoting David, right? And so in David's life, the things that were coming back to him were those eggs that bound together, the kind of character that people wanted to help, even if they saw his flaws. Likewise, on the other hand, to the degree that those eggs of falsehood have begun to sink down deep into our inmost selves. Understand that I got to close with this because I don't have to preach too long already. But the other thing, you turn back to me, we'll close. You turn back with me, please, to Psalm 12, I think it is, Psalm 12. The last thing I want to do, or the last place I want deception to sink into in my inmost self, is my place of joy. May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, verse 3, chapter 12. The tongue that makes great boasts, they say, with our tongue we will prevail. Our lips are with us. Who is master over us? And that's two concepts. Please don't confuse those as being a single concept. When I begin to look at deception as a playing field, then I am in a tough place. And why would I mention that? It is because we are in a society where more and more we are herded into places of competition. You have no shortage of people who are offering you the opportunity to gain, like we said, that whole concept of self-esteem. If I'm allowing dishonesty to sink into my inmost self, one of those emotional voids that I need to fill is I need to feel like I'm getting some wins in life. I need to feel like I'm accomplishing something, like I'm getting some things done. And don't overlook the way in which being able to outsmart other people can be a source of self-esteem. And what is happening here is he's saying in verse 4, it's simple, with our tongue we will prevail. Please don't overlook the emotion in that. Please don't overlook the potential that, like we said, it's one thing if I like I'm David. I've done it 3 times. Most people say once, it's a mistake. Twice, it's whatever. 3 times, it's a habit. It doesn't have to be. And that's the beauty of David's story. Even if it's become a repetitive pattern, it doesn't have to sink into our inmost selves. And it can stop. And the danger of finding joy in those places where we need to get some wins in outsmarting others through twisting the truth is that, as we said before, at the end of verse 4, our lips are with us, who is master over us. Over time, it grows into something else. And it becomes a part of my sense of purpose. Because it's not just a quick source of joy. Now I'm starting to need falsehood. You ever heard, we're at a time in our life when kids have they have guidance counselors, which are helping us. What's my course in life? And you think does that stop after you get out of college? I shifted gears. I was one thing coming out of college. Am I the same thing now? I know a lot of people wish I had been back. Yes, no. Yes, I'm different. But anyway. Because you can spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what your purpose is. And here's the thing that you don't want sinking down into your inmost self is no matter what you are doing, you do not want to begin to derive your sense of purpose behind or from your ability to convince people of things that just might not be true. Once we begin to allow these things to sink into our inmost self, understand. Preach too long. Once these things have begun to sink down in our inmost self, then it's hard to undo. And so the beauty of these passages from David, like we said already, repetition or even a habit, it does not mean condemnation. What it means is David has painted a path of two different paths actually for us. Like we said in Psalm 23, God, please lead us along paths of righteousness. Please lead us along paths that help us see the value in not only treating people with integrity, but realizing the ways in which you repay us abundantly, many times over, multiples, kindness we never thought we could have because of simple things we might have done for others. But likewise, Lord, to the degree that we have allowed dishonesty to become fun, please help us and deliver us from ourselves. In Jesus' name.